Okay, just to give people some context, one of the things when I first envisioned this series that I wanted to do was have a discussion on motor learning that would help kind of clarify some things that get talked about a lot in coaching that oftentimes it appears to me that people don't really understand what they mean. Um, some of it has to do with things like block versus random plus distributed training and stuff along what specificity means. So as a starting point, what I want, what I wanted from Harjiv today is to clarify those things, and then we can kind of progress the conversation off from there and get into stuff where we could talk about how it all. So why don't we start there, Harjiv? Why don't you kind of lay out what exactly the academics, the researchers mean when they use those terms?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so I had the privilege actually to work pretty much under or right along beside Dr. Richard McGill when I was over at Columbia doing my master's. And, Dr. Richard McGill was a pretty prominent researcher when it came to contextual interference. And contextual interference is what we talk about in terms of blocked and random practice and whatnot. So I think the a basic starting point is what practice variability means. Practice variability essentially just refers to the variety of movement and context characteristics a athlete sort of experiences while practicing a skill. And so that's where creating more or kind of going through more error is better for learning. And this comes from like the Schmidt schema theory and generalized motor program and all that. But that's just the sort of the underpinning of it. The practice conditions should include sort of non-regulatory conditions and regulatory conditions. And the only difference between that is, are you varying the number of players, playing partners, the importance of specific tasks and whatnot. So that's practice variability, and practice variability has taken off ever since that sort of initial hypothesis and all that. So when you go to blocked and random practice, it was essentially that's contextual interference, and the original thought was way back in 1966, I think it was, with Beidig, and so. Contextual interference means it's a means to organize variable practice. And so it refers to this idea of memory and performance disruption resulting from performing multiple skills or variations of a skill within the context of practice. It's a continuum, essentially. You have random practice, which is high contextual interference. Then you have blocked practice, which is low contextual interference. Blocked practice essentially refers to practicing a task in an order where you're doing the task under stable conditions or the same conditions. So it looks good. A lot of coaches say that looks really good. You see immediate success. So an example would be like a setter, for example, doing setting 31s during individuals on a Monday and a Tuesday. Random practice, on the other hand, refers to this high contextual interference where you're practicing the task under these randomized conditions. People often say it's like more game-like and stuff like that. But when you compare the two, random looks more ugly, but is good for like retention and transfer. That's what the literature has shown. And that goes through all skills. I mean, you're talking about lab-based studies. The idea has been stemming from even before 1975. I mean, it's been quite a bit of research showing that random practice it works. So if we go back to the setter example, your setter is setting now a 31 on a 4-ball, back to a 31 to a 4-ball on a Monday, and then on Tuesday you're going to do a 4-ball to a 31, a 4-ball to a 31, and something like that. That's sort of what random practice is. And so there's a continuum, like I mentioned. So you want to go from sort of blocked to random. You want to go from low contextual interference to high contextual interference, and by doing so, you have what's called serial. I guess a good way to put it is that you have serial order, which means that if there's a random repetition of short blocks, so you're going from essentially the gold question is how do I go from more low contextual interference to high contextual interference, and that's like you add some serial practice in there where essentially you're doing you're doing sort of like, I'm going from a 4 to a shoot to a 31, a 4 to a shoot to a 31, and kind of you structure it in a serial manner. Now, one of the things that's really important to understand, and I'm not an expert. I just kind of I'm a really big nerd, and so I read a lot and I try to figure it out. I've had the blessing to be under some really, really awesome mentors. But I think the key takeaway is that your blocked practice can also be random in nature. So if you go back to generalized motor programs, there was this idea that, and again, generalized motor programs kind of came off of this idea of memory. And so essentially, if we go back to there was this concept of variable and constant practice. And so variable and constant practice was, am I doing the task sort of differently? So say, for example, I'm throwing a ball. Am I going from 4 meters to 5 meters, 6 meters, or am I just staying at 5 meters and doing it for a certain number of trials? And the only reason I say that example is because our lab published a study 2 years ago on focus of attention and practice variability. And it was pretty interesting to find that the more random you are or the more variable you are, it affects your attentional focus. But we'll get into that later. I think the important thing is that if you're doing a more blocked task, so let's say, for example, I'm working on hitting, I'm working on my outside hitter and I'm setting balls to the outside. That's the task. The task is on the outside is hitting the ball. Now, underneath that, you can either be constant, meaning I'm going to hit a 4 ball, and that's all I'm going to hit for like whatever, how many reps it is. So 4 ball, 4 ball, 4 ball. Or variable, meaning I'm going to go from a 4 to a shoot to any other variation of that. And so while it's blocked in nature in terms of your practice scheduling, it's still random because you're adding that sort of variable constant practice sort of thing. So I think a good takeaway for coaches is that it's a continuum first. You want to sort of, really work with your athletes, see where the athletes are in terms of the skill that you're trying to get at. And that the practice schedule should be, moderate to high contextual interference, because the literature has shown that sort of, I guess, is important for retention and transfer and all that. But be prepared to accommodate to more less contextual interference approach or more blocked in nature. And I think that's the important considerations are skill level, task difficulty, for example. I can be very random in nature, but the task can be very easy, or the task goal can be easy. Or I can be very random in nature and have the task goal be extremely difficult. And that all goes to our current work, which is on, more so intrinsic motivation and attention. But I think that's sort of a good takeaway to have, is that there's a lot at play, but it's not blocked or random. It is a continuum that you have to follow. And I think a good way to, when you design practice, is, which part of the continuum are you working on, essentially. I hope that sort of makes sense.
Yeah, well, people could definitely ask questions if they need some clarification. The thing that comes up a lot in these discussions and debates about motor learning, about block versus random, is the difference between new players or new to a skill players and obviously experienced players. And where the argument is probably pretty strong that with new players, you may go a lot more toward block, low contextual interference, as they develop an understanding of what's expected of them. And then eventually you progress them on, you increase the interference and go more progressively down the random route. So what's the kind of the idea from the literature in terms of when you want to start making that progression away from very low contextual interference, teaching the basic elements of the skill, to starting to progress them along the path?
Yeah, I think success is really important, right? Are they actually doing what's being asked? Are they completing the goal of the task? Is the goal of the task, sort of game-like in nature? Or are they looking really good if we just toss a ball over a net? Or are they looking really good because we are, actually passing a ball over or serving a ball or whatever it may be? Are we in fact using the net, or are we just tossing from the side of the net where they're passing on? So there's a lot of things to look into. I would argue that with my sort of interactions with these national team players, even at the international level, this idea of blocked or conscious training, where coaches are really trying to hone in on certain things or whatever, and they kind of do that in the beginning of practice. I don't think that's detrimental to performance. I think blocked is a good way to kind of get sort of like a feel for the movement, for the task. But I think there's so many things at play. I think the issue with coaching or with coaches is that we kind of look at it through like a linear perspective of like you have blocked practice and that's all you have, but you still have, how are you instructing the player? How much feedback are you giving the player? What type of feedback are you giving them? When are you going to give them feedback? What are you using to give them feedback? If instruction related, I have the privilege to be under Dr. Gabby Wolf, who really spearheaded a lot of the attention literature. So are we telling them to really concentrate on their body, or are we telling them to concentrate on sort of like their movement effect, which is more so an external cue in nature? And it does, there's so many things in play that we have to really look at it as a whole. But I think back to your question, I think success is really important. Does it translate what you're doing to, let's say, when you go play 6-on-6, which is what you're actually preparing for? And so I think that's sort of what you have to work with. And every athlete's different. You're not going to have, it's not like a milestone where like after 2 years you reach something and you move on. This is all very individual. Positions matter. There's so many things to look into, but it's a good framework to have. We're like, okay, if my athlete's not succeeding in this blocked practice, maybe if I do make it random, it'll be better, or the other way around. We all have basically our own learning sort of approaches, and how we learn is different. So I get to take a lot of educational psychology classes here just because I'm really interested in these learning methods. And one of the things is you got to have your athletes sort of own their own learning. What works for them. It's interesting to even ask, what cues are working for you? What cues do you like? Do you prefer what that I say as a coach? So all this kind of pays attribute to making that sort of jump from really low contextual interference to high. But again, the literature has shown that no matter what sort of level of expertise you're at, moderate to high contextual interference is always beneficial, at least from the literature.
Sure. There's also the I guess this would be the specificity question, which is making things as game-like as possible, which kind of fits in with the rest of it. Because you could be very blocked, but also pretty game-like, but you can also be quite random and not be game-like at all.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think so. Practice specificity is really important because the definition actually is really along the lines of this idea of you want to make everything sort of people refer to practice specificity as more game-like scenarios. And so it's the idea of the sensory perceptual information, the performance characteristics, the cognitive sort of processes involved. It's important to understand that practice specificity appears by looking at the literature in first glance, it appears that practice specificity contradicts sort of practice variability. And so the issue is that they're studied under different domains. Specificity of practice, the hypothesis that is in specificity is certain characteristics of the context that's there. And variability, on the other hand, is specifically to like the movement characteristics of the skill. So is the context the same, right? Am I playing 6-on-6, which is what I'm going to be doing in the actual game, versus the actual skill, which is really based on variability. So I think it's what we've done is we've taken the practice variability, the principle of specificity hypothesis, and basically said that everything's got to be game-like no matter what. The specificity hypothesis really just looks at context. Is the context the same? as what you're going to be sort of transferring to, for example. And the variability sort of approach is, the actual characteristics of the skill itself. So I think that's where the difference is. And I think that's what's, it got me for quite a number of years. I had to figure that out too, but I think that's sort of a good sort of separation between the two. But nonetheless, if the context is the same, that's your specificity. But the context has to really involve the sort of the perceptual sort of nature of what the game is. So it doesn't make sense essentially to go ahead and pass against a wall when you have a gym available. It's like that type of thing. Yeah.
While we're kind of on these foundational theories, I guess this would be a good point to bring in. And Simon is on here, so he sent an email earlier with a couple of questions. One of them is on it's something you hear about in Europe more than you hear in the U.S., which is the idea of differential learning, as opposed to the slightly different Schmidt schema. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Differential learning is really promising, I think. It's fairly new in terms of what it's trying to do. Dr. Schulhorn is, if I'm pronouncing his name right, he's really, his research is phenomenal. What he's trying to do, I think, is phenomenal. With my interactions from him, the guy's super passionate about this stuff. But I think without getting into the methodology, because the methodology is actually based on a lot of neural dynamics, and if I were to get into like the math and physics behind it, that would take about another 10 hours, which I don't think everyone has a lot of. But the idea is that there's a lot of variability with errors, and so you're purposely inducing this sort of noise, and you're basically going to the two extreme ends, right? So let's say you're working on passing, and you want, your player is doing something wrong. Just that, and then you need to fix that. You're going to make them do that, right? Just to feel what the error actually feels like, right? I don't know how to really put it, but let's say they're not really angling their platform the right way, for example, right? You're going to make sure that they go to the extreme of failing at the task, so they recognize that they have to angle their platform for something. Okay. So you make them go to that really extreme nature, and every single repetition is different than the other. You're basically, I think a good way to put it is you're basically giving them every single thing that you could imagine at once, and so like they're going through this idea of, I'm gonna pass over my right shoulder, then my left shoulder. I'm going to be on one foot. I'm going to be sliding to the left, sliding to the right. I'm going to go up, go back. I mean, it's these things that you induce just because you want them to sort of get like this framework of errors and success and everything all in one. And so you're purposely inducing this noise. And so you do that essentially because there is no movement pattern specified, but you're encouraging your athlete to actually figure it out themselves. It's slightly different than contextual interference, and oftentimes the two get confused. It's slightly different because it's not technically like repetitive in nature or focusing on context, which is what contextual interference is, but it's rather the rise of these fluctuations during like these transition phases. And it's technically, in the scientific terms, it's called dissipative systems, and that's all physics. But basically, you're inducing these perturbations so the athlete feels the most extreme ends alongside the middle portion of it. So it's very, very new. I don't think coaches are, I wouldn't say coaches are not using. I think coaches are utilizing it without knowing what it is. So error correction, for example, right? I know it's a drill a lot of coaches use. I had the privilege to volunteer here for the UNLV volleyball program for my first year, and error correction was a really interesting drill to me, where a player might have made an error, and the coach would allow them to do it again, I think that's a good example of differential learning. Obviously, there's the intricacies of it, but I think that's a sort of good example of it.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. The way you describe it, it sounds almost like random training on steroids. Like you're intentionally
Yeah,
inducing every single possible, okay, try it this way, try it this way, try it this way. And I can imagine coaches thinking, oh my God, well, how do we teach them how to do it right?
yeah,
But that's not the idea. It's more of a self-discovery mechanism rather than
yeah. And
we're
so
trying to teach a specific movement pattern.
right, and so I think what the coaches fall into the rut of is providing feedback or instruction every single or after a certain number of reps. So what happens is you kind of disallow this idea of self-discovery, right? You're not really allowing them to self-discover. You're telling them what to discover, and that's kind of like that's the issue of it. And so back to the error correction drilling, right? It's, a player hits the ball out, I'm going to toss a ball or tell the setter to set the ball the same way or whatever it may be. But you're allowing them to at least feel more successful, number one, give them options and all that, give them opportunities, but you're not saying anything. And I think that's when they say words matter, they truly do at the end of the day. And so I think that's important to know.
Right. Well, and I liked what you said before about how it's important to consider the big picture of all this and all the different elements to go into it. And, so you get a situation where somebody has been a block training coach for years and years and years, and they think that that's why they're a successful coach, when in fact, it could be that they're just fantastic at feedback.
Yeah, yeah.
Or they're a really good communicator and motivate their players exceedingly well. So maybe they are not technically a great trainer from a motor learning perspective, but they're extremely effective because of other things that they bring to the equation.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. And so, yeah, coaches just should consider all those different things. And it's hard. I'm not going to lie. It's, as a coach, you have a lot on your plate, and that, structuring practice is as hard as, that's probably one of the most hardest things. But then you got to worry about what you're saying. It's a lot. But I would encourage coaches to just find what's working for them. The literature is the literature, right? We can provide you some sort of guide, but that doesn't mean that it's going to work or not work for your specific player or your team. So that is something to understand. Yeah.
Just so everybody knows, you can ask questions anytime you want. Best thing to use is the question and answer function. Although if you can't figure that out, you can use the chat as well. We'll probably see it one way or the other. Throw them in there whenever you want. If it's something that we're not talking about in the moment, I'll hold it and we'll get around to it eventually. Otherwise, we'll carry on. I know you did a presentation at AVCA that was focused a lot on feedback. So I'm curious to go into that a little bit more, because there's so many different types of feedback, and I think you talked a lot about the timing and the spacing of feedback, but there's also, and you kind of already touched on this, external versus internal. And I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are on say, outcome, because that's obviously a form of feedback. Plus, how a lot of people these days are using video replay, and how that factors into all of it.
Yeah, that was a fun presentation. That presentation was kind of last minute in a way. Me and Coach Sparrow have been talking for some time, along with Dr. Becker. And we were just talking about feedback, and I think there's just so much. I couldn't really talk about it in an hour, and I realized that the lingo that I was using was not sort of appropriate for coaches. And so it was really hard for me. And it kind of gave me sort of a learning experience where I was like, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. That's why I decided to pursue my PhD, is because I want to be able to translate this information. I think volleyball is just very under-researched in general. And so to have the opportunity to do both, I think is really awesome. But I think, so for feedback, there's a couple things that you have to look into. It's, how do you give feedback? What do you actually say or do? And then when do you give it? And so There's different types of feedback. I mean, there's task intrinsic feedback, which is just sort of like the sensory feedback that one's getting, and then there's this augmented feedback, which is what you're giving. And so essentially, this can be like knowledge of performance, which is sort of I'm giving you feedback on your actual biomechanical patterns. You're bring your elbow low or high, whatever it may be, or knowledge of results, which is mainly just the result of your movement, where the ball went, etc. I think the most important thing, however, is the attentional focus realm and how that affects your intrinsic motivation. And I think that's sort of new in terms of the literature, because the idea was really spearheaded by my advisor, and where she put out the optimal theory in 2016. But the idea is that attentional focus is primarily two realms, or two sort of different types of foci. And then internal focus of attention, you're just really concentrating on your body movements, and external, your movement effects. So an example would be in serving, I can be focused on really rotating my hips, or I can focus on, the target on the other side of the court. And then, I mean, the external foci debate, over 25 years of research has shown external focus is far beyond better. And that's through all different types of sports, different types of measures, and all levels of expertise and disability. So I think the research there is pretty fair, but this idea of feedback is important. What we found was that, while we say, less is more in terms of talking, there's been evidence that says, feedback given 100% of the time in an external focus realm is actually beneficial than giving it less than 100%. And so you have to really toy around with what you're looking at, what type of what skill you're giving feedback for, what part of the skill you're giving feedback for. My research right now is looking at the distance effect of the external focus. So an external focus can be broken down into one that's closer to your body, one that's farther away from your body. And that has significant effects in terms of who you're coaching, the level of expertise of your player, and the skill itself. And, we're still getting into the research, and unfortunately we had to stop because of COVID, but I think that's really important to understand. And then outside of that, you mentioned like the technology that's available. I think technology is, you have to work it to your advantage. It doesn't make sense to me when you're have video playback systems to tell your athlete to go check it out every time. One of the most important things that I've read in terms of the intrinsic motivation literature is that watching yourself succeed more is really beneficial. So it doesn't make sense often, or at least most of the time, to send your player to a video playback system and watch and tell them what they did wrong, or tell them to see what they did wrong. You should most probably show them all the good aspects of what they did right. I think that goes along the lines of observational learning, especially now for coaches, where you don't have time with your player. I see a lot of coaches now with that they're sort of giving workouts and all that to their players and whatnot. That's great and all, but the issue is, and I actually talked about it this morning with a couple of friends, is that the issue is that you come back after 3 or 4 months or wherever we come back, hopefully it's soon. The rate of injury is going to go super high because you just haven't trained the way that you're supposed to. So like college athletes, right? You're going to go right into, when you say you come back in August, you play in like 3 weeks, right? And so do I go right into this idea of I'm going to give them as much information as I can, put them in random practice and play game-like scenarios? No, we have to ease them in somehow because they haven't been training that way for so long. Pretty much off tangent, but I think the important takeaway is now what you can do as coaches is use observational learning to advantage, where you're sort of sending video or sending film to your players on their best performances, what they've done right. Shoot them a prompt. Again, like I said, own your own learning. Give them like a little prompt to do. Ask them, what did you think you did right? What did you think you did wrong? Let them actually analyze the video. And not, because I know if you give a 16-year-old girl, film, she's going to just be in awe of her what she's doing right, and so allow them to think a little bit of it. So have them write, maybe even send them a video of what they did right. A couple of days later, what they need to work on. Allow them to sort of create sort of like a Venn diagram sort of thing where they're kind of contrasting all that. And this is all types of feedback, right? This is essentially you're giving them feedback without actually talking. And so that's one way. But feedback in general, there's in terms of the verbal feedback literature, I always think that you want to promote this idea of confidence. You want to promote this idea of autonomy within the feedback that you give. So I think if you give let's say an athlete is having trouble sort of passing the ball in serve receive or servers and passers, right? It's a usual popular drill people use, and so some of the things is either some coaches either don't talk at all, or they'll just kind of go into saying you're not doing this right. You have to, for example, bring your wrists and hands together, right? Or you have to I think in order to be an autonomy supportive coach, which sort of promotes this growth mindset within your individuals and whatnot, you have to give them sort of rationale when you're talking. Autonomy support goes well beyond verbal. It's how your culture is and whatnot. But in terms of the verbal aspect of it, giving them, just asking them, hey, you may want to try this, or you may want to do this, because this is what I've seen success. This is what I've seen success from. And so it's the way you talk actually has a really big difference in what your players actually do in terms of their motor performance. And then confidence. I think the more success you have, the more success a player has, the better it is, right? I think it goes well beyond saying good job, great job. Okay, what do they do good? What do they do a good job in? What do they do a great job? And they need to know that. Oftentimes we fall into the rut of saying, you did a good job, but you did this terribly, and then that kind of negates the fact that you're kind of promoting this confident nature. And so it's tricky because as coaches we are considered like half of our job is motivating our team. And so, motivation is one thing. How you do it is another thing. And I think that's sort of where we're at right now. And that a lot of that has to do with basically what we say to them. And then when we go into like frequency is how much we give. Are we giving them too little? Are we giving them too much? I think that really, again, the skill matters, the way you're talking matters. I think there's so much to consider, and I'm more than happy to send papers out and stuff like that. Yeah.
I think I remember you saying, or maybe I read this in a paper, where in terms of feedback, with a more experienced, a more mastered level athlete, you want to be very specific because that's what they need to progress themselves. Probably less frequent, but more specific.
Yeah.
Whereas with a newer developing player, you might have to be more feedback, more frequency of feedback, but more generalized. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. But I would argue that, I think that's a general consensus. I will argue sometimes that you need to be specific with like sort of the younger kids. Their minds are kind of all over the place when they're young. But I think that's the general consensus. Is that again, you can be talking and give feedback a lot. The problem is how you give it. And so if you're telling a 12-year-old girl to fix her elbow every single time, I don't think you're going to get much out of it. So if you tell her to concentrate on a target or the net or step toward the target or step toward the net to kind of really get that serve going, and there's different ways to do it. But I think at the more elite level, the specific the better, just because these guys know what they're doing, right? They've kind of automatized these movement patterns. What matters mostly is how you structure their practice. And I think that's sort of the key thing there. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and related to what you were saying, it sounded like the feedback should be probably a lot more in the form of do rather than don't, positive rather than negative.
Yeah, I think that's the whole premise of if you just look up optimal theory of motor learning, it's a new theory that came out. And if you just take a read at that, I think it kind of gives you the breakdown of not only attention, but the intrinsic motivation realm of things that we kind of don't look, that we kind of really just skim over, don't really worry about. But I think it's really affects performance. I think one of the things I said at AVCA last year, which was a great experience. I think being able to talk to coaches was awesome. Sucks that my flight got canceled. I had to drive all the way down there from New Jersey. But I think one of the important things about just lost my train of thought. I'm talking about optimal theory.
Yeah, optimal theory. Positive versus do versus don't.
Yeah. Sorry. So one of the things about autonomy was that giving them a choice, right? And so I mentioned that any choice could basically benefit performance, and that's the idea. The idea is allowing your player to sort of have control over that environment that they're in. So you're not really, I guess you're not really prescribing things. You're sort of just giving them the opportunity to take control of certain like, I guess, parts of the environment, the task itself. So example for younger kids, colorful balls is something that I've seen people use. So what color ball do you want to use? That's one thing. Older individuals in college, they're really honed in on what Gatorade and Powerade they drink. It doesn't seem like it's going to affect anything, but it's still this idea of giving them a choice and the choice is, related to performance because, those Gatorades and all that, they're at the gym. And so what we've seen is even these choices that are not related to the task actually still affect it. But in more so related to task, what part of practice they want to do first, right? Do they want to start off with serve receiving, or do they want to do that towards the end? Let them control practice. Maybe allow one of your players to, come up with a drill, for example, or whatnot. Other things of like if you're working on routes, for example, right? Your middle blocker is going to run I might get my terminology wrong here, but wants to run a 31. So as a coach, you want to really focus on the 31 and the 1. Ask them what they want to go first with. It's simple as that, rather than telling them what to do. Blocking, I think, is really critical because there's so many different ways to block. That when you're practicing the actual skill, obviously when you're really paying attention to, say, the 3-step block, you really want to hone in on that. But when you're not, and you say you're in a game, allow them to kind of figure it out on their own in terms of what block they want to use. I'm talking about in practice, not in like an actual competition setting. But if you're doing a drill where there's different, you're just going over different blocking sort of schemes, allow them to choose which one to do. And then typically, in the older sort of national team level, you have a lot of camaraderie between these individuals. They've been together for so long. That's actually to your benefit. Let them collaborate, let them figure it out. And as a coach, you kind of just be that facilitator. But there's so many things there. And we can't underestimate the value of intrinsic motivation. I always encourage coaches to really use the science that we have available to look into that. For example, heart rate. Heart rate has is really reliable in terms of your motivational levels, at least from what I've seen. And so allowing to monitor heart rate over a period of practice or whatever it may be can really affect the way you structure practice and evidently what you say to them. And then these readiness scales that colleges start using in terms of if they, for example, have an exam that week, several exams, or for ladies that are in their menstrual cycle, these things all affect their cognitive. And I think coaching is now transitioning to this more cognitive, affective sort of nature of motor behavior that, even the lack of sleep that they get can affect, how they perform, number one. But then, are they going to be willing to take all the feedback that you give? How are you going to give it? How much are you going to give it? If you know that there's 3 kids on your team that have exams on Tuesday, is Monday going to be your hardest day? You got to really, really look at that aspect, which I'm sure coaches do. I know at the more collegiate level, they're really, you really hone in on their academics and you see when they have exams and whatnot. But there's other things that you don't know, right? The lack of sleep. Did they have breakfast in the morning? And that can actually affect a lot of things. So, I always encourage coaches to really look at everything. It really boggles me when this idea of blocked and random practice comes and that's all they talk about. And there's so much to consider. Yeah.
Well, I think one of the issues is a lot of people are not in a position, an upper level college coach where they're basically a full-time coach. They've got trainers and strength coaches and all these people to contribute in. For example, are they doing things like we did a session with David Gill from Vert on jump frequencies and jump heights and impact landings and all that. So how's that feeding into how you're sharing the load out? We've talked about RPE, and that's perceived, rate of perceived exertion, which is a subjective thing from the players. I know Kevin Hambley's talked about how they use that at Stanford. So there's a lot of stuff that you can use, but but if you're a juniors coach, for example, or maybe you're a high school coach, or you don't have a lot of time and resources to bring that stuff in. Okay, you focus on the things that you think you can focus on.
Yeah, that's why I think, something like a questionnaire is so simple to use, especially at the younger levels. A questionnaire is simple that you just send it to them and they'll do it. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there's some definitely barriers there. On your, actually this morning we just had a talk on fatigue and motor skill learning. And so, what that study showed was that with fatigue, you sort of if you reach a fatigue state, you don't learn. I mean, it doesn't help. And so a lot of times these coaches are coming from, it's important, at least for college settings, it's important where you're going from strength and conditioning right to practice. And then you're trying to teach them something to just, look into. But on your notion of David Gill, who actually we used the Vert here a lot. And I've had a couple interactions with him. And I do encourage all coaches, at least if you can, to definitely invest in that product. But what we also showed is that just using the Vert, allowing them to, I think it was one of our lab members did a study where they just got the ability to choose what shape they wanted to jump from. It was, it was a novice study, but the aspect of choice, and it was basically like colored sort of shapes on the floor. And by just choosing what shape you wanted to jump from, you jumped higher. And so it's these little things that we don't really think about as coaches, right? We're like, what the hell does that mean? It actually, benefits from what we've seen, at least. I would encourage researchers to definitely look more into the expertise scale, at least going from novice to an expert. And that's what I'm trying to do, hopefully, is really look at these expert level athletes and these Division I players, these national team level players. What makes them different? Number one, we all know that they're better in terms of their skill, but there's other things we have to look into because one of the best ways to, and this is something that I got from my educational psychology classes, is that when you're learning a task or learning a skill, now albeit all the stuff we learn is like learning like math, for example, but you can definitely correlate the information to like motor skills. And you want to always make sure that for a novice that they have some sort of framework into what an expert looks like, what they're trying to get to. And not only does that like affect like positive affect, which is like, oh, they're good. I want to be like that. I'm motivated to do so. So that's where the research I think needs to go now, is like looking this novice to expert debate, seeing what actually changes. We know what experts do, we know what novices do, but what is actually changing? That's, I think, a key variable that hopefully, I can help steer. So.
All right, we got a question that came in, and this is something that comes up on a fairly regular basis. I have an outside hitter with a goofy-footed approach. In practice, she's able to do the quote-unquote correct footwork, but once meaningful competition starts, she reverts. She's had much better success outcomes with her goofy-footed approach, so she's not motivated to change. What's the best way to teach a new motor skill to override the existing one?
Well, I think if she's having success with it, right? That's a good question. If she's having success with it, and it's, I would probably want to ask what level it is, but let's just say if it's like a novice or it's one of those club level players, if they're having success with it and they're putting the ball away, their percentages are high, changing it might be more detrimental. However, you obviously want to take into account injuries and different sort of biomechanical factors that are important. So yeah, if she's doing her goofy step approach and all of a sudden there's like severe knee valgus, that's a cause for concern. I think most of it comes down to, she's having a lot of confidence. If you go back to that differential learning approach, make her sort of understand what works and what doesn't work. Really get to that extreme. That's one way. That comes down to practice design and how you actually, what are you doing in terms of your practice, right? Are you just, if she just, you're tossing a ball and she's just hitting and she has a goofy a goofy approach, or is it that when you I think she said she's able to do a correct footwork, but once and then it just kind of goes down to practicing more game-like is important, where she needs to just have more sort of repetition within that sort of context where there's a lot of moving parts when it comes to playing 6-on-6. She's an outside hitter, so she's passing the ball, then she has to transition. What's going on, and all those different factors that may sort of affect this. So I would just encourage this coach to kind of just really take on the realm of practicing more game-like. And I know we hear about it so much, but really taking the definitions of a block, random, variable, constant, and really incorporating that into what you want to accomplish. Now, another thing you can do is if this person is, let's say, a club level player, really trying to be, let's say trying to go play in college or whatever, trying to be her best, you may want to show her, situations where she's done it the right way. I'm sure there's been one or two scenarios, so show her that. Let her compare herself, and then most importantly, I think show her, an expert model, whether it be in a form of a video or a form of someone that comes into the gym. But you always want to compare that expert model with the individual's sort of approach. You never want to just show an expert. I think so. I used to coach before I got into this PhD program, and I really had no sort of understanding of how to coach. And so one of the things was, let's show videos of experts. So we would show the U.S. national team play, and everyone would kind of come in a circle and watch. But you don't get anything out of it. You want to change something, show them, and then point to what they're doing and what the national team is doing, or whatever you have on the screen, and then utilize that information. I think the most effective is self-modeling, which is you're showing them their own sort of things. A lot of different ways. Cueing here as well. Are you just really focusing on your cues and on your instruction directly at her actual technique? What if she just changed her focus? What if she just focused on where she's hitting the ball rather than actually her footwork, and her footwork will kind of emerge? So there's a lot of things to play around with, I think. I hope that answers that. I tend to ramble on a lot. And I'm nowhere near an expert, like I mentioned. I'm still trying to learn from all of you. So, just play around with it is probably the best best bet.
Well, and to your earlier point about the error, the correction drills and games.
Yeah.
No, if you're in a game-like situation in practice and she does a goofy approach, well, you can give her a chance to repeat that attack and do it with the proper footwork. You know she can do it. Obviously, she demonstrates it in the drills. But yeah, I definitely agree with the modeling and because if she doesn't think she's doing anything bad because she's having the outcome she's wanting to get, then a motivation is obviously the big hurdle that you're going to have to overcome. You know, and it may be a case where if all she ever wants to do is play junior volleyball or high school volleyball and that's it, okay. As long as she doesn't, not at risk of hurting herself, then you just let it go and let her have fun and be part of a team.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I don't know if you can see this. In response, for people who can't see this, the questioner said, "Do show her video." Then she shows me Karchfeld Dahlhauser, who both have goofy-footed approaches. She started playing on the beach. Now, I can't speak to Phil, but Karch was not goofy-footed indoors. He was only goofy-footed outdoors. So make sure she looks at him playing indoors to fix that.
That's the thing, right? You're still goofy-footed, but you're still really good. So it just, I think that's the problem with technique is that, and that's why this whole sort of dynamical systems approach ever really started. But this idea of there's some idealized technique that you want to get to. I don't think there's an idealized technique. There's just the most optimal way to do it. And for that individual, it might be that way. And like I said, just injury sort of wise, she's not really showing any knee valgus, for example. I mean, I wouldn't go to an extent that you really want to change it, but you can use other means to do so, right? Without really even telling. So one of the things that I talked about at ABCA was there's certain information that's going to hinder learning. There's certain information that's going to help learning. And then there's certain information that's just worthless. It's not gonna matter. Even if you say it's not gonna matter. So you really have to play it. So for example, every time she does do it, this goofy set approach, you don't need to mention it. Use different means like practice design, like observational learning or video analysis, and let them figure it out, right? That's the whole point of learning. And I think those are actually more effective, essentially.
The other thing I would toss in there in terms of, I can't speak to Phil, but I believe Coach intentionally went goofy-footed on the beach because it was specifically more effective there. Yeah. Because you don't really have to max jump quite as much on the beach, especially in those old days where he was playing on the full-size court and had a lot of room to try to work around the defense. Game's a little different now. Okay, we got another question. We just talked about observational learning. Is there a learning value in designing practice in a way that athletes have opportunities to observe their teammates, as opposed to themselves, in the same position, perform the skill live, where maybe they're alternating?
Oh yeah, that's That's called dyad learning. Sorry, there was a study. One of the initial studies early on. The task essentially was one person practiced a skill, the other person watched. And then they switched, and what they found was that it really sort of allowed these ones that were sitting kind of work out strategies, for example, but then also they communicated to each other in terms of strategies and all that, what to use, and that goes all back down to culture and camaraderie. As coaches, you have a really tough job, and unfortunately I think you guys are really underpaid for what you do, but it's the job is that you're building a culture and that these players should feel comfortable enough to talk with one another, to encourage one another. There might be a point where there's two outside hitters fighting for a starting spot and they don't want to talk to one another. How do we kind of go about that, right? Who's your captain? What's the role of a captain? There's so many things to consider, but I think what you're saying is right on. If you look up any literature on dyad training, that's all it does, is this idea of strategy development and encouragement goes a really long way when it comes to observational learning. And that can be of a video, or it can be of actual game that you're watching in real life, or you're actually part of it and you're actually doing it. I think one of the a lot of coaches like to demonstrate themselves, which is great. I think it's definitely worth it. But I would encourage them to kind of do that less, just because you're always showing them one way to do it, and that's all you have to do. It's kind of like put like a rule on it, where you kind of show them a couple times and then that's it. Allow everyone else to do it, and then your feedback alone. Again, like I mentioned, feedback is really important. Your feedback alone to these individuals will generate this internal conversation, which will generate more strategy development and encouragement. So, yeah.
Related to that, actually, and this could go along an entirely different topic, but I know Karch, or at least in some of his clinics and things, he has players, shadow or mirror behind somebody in their position. It's not really dyad per se. I think it's more along the lines of visualization and that sort of angle on learning.
Yeah, that Karch is he's phenomenal because of the way he approaches learning, from my opinion. And so I think that's a really good strategy to use, is that this idea of mirroring and stuff like that. I mean, that's mirror neurons at the end of the day, right? That's research has been on for so many years. Observational sort of what's it called? Not observational learning, but there's observational networks in our brain. That was actually what I originally wanted to do my PhD in, was observational learning, and not only that, but the observation networks in our brain. Really good researcher at the University of Verona in Italy that does that stuff. Yeah, I think that's super important just for the mirror neuron purposes.
Okay. We hit the hour, so if anybody has any more questions, time to get them in now. We've got a long one. Okay, from Simon. What does your strength training look like? Would you recommend to? I suppose you could answer this. This really isn't kind of the topic. It's do you learn to jerk or jumping higher and avoiding injuries, or is two different from actual volleyball jump? So that's kind of a strength and conditioning versus actual performance.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. I do have a strength and conditioning background, so I think there's opportunities for both. Obviously, you want to increase, there's ways to increase your power, and you can't do that by just playing the game. You got to supplement that somehow. So the question, would you recommend learn the clean and jerk to jump a little higher? Yeah, clean and jerk is all about, from my opinion, is all about power development, a lot of force and a little bit of time, and that's essentially what volleyball is, especially as a hitter or stuff like that. So learning it is also very difficult. I'll be honest with you. There's actually a paper that came out on learning to clean and jerk using a constraints led approach, if you want to check it out, by this Journal of Strength and Conditioning. But I think, I think 100% you want to supplement it. And clean and jerk is a really good exercise to do so. And I think he said, for example, Shohan often is that he's going to use myself. Again, it depends on the skill, right? I think a lot of Dr. Shohan's work, if I'm not mistaken, is not, it's not sports that involve this type of movement, for example. And so, yeah, of course, you want to use this idea of strength training to supplement your actual training. And the clean and jerk is a good exercise because it mimics a lot of what you do in volleyball. So you want to be aware of what exercises you actually do. And
your pronunciation is really good.
Oh. Yeah, and then just I think your second point is, for example, the strength of the pectoralis and shoulder of a sprinter. He would just let them sprint with straight arms, and that's fine. But like I said, for a sprinter, the arms matter, but is that the most important sort of thing for a sprinter? I would probably argue that a lot more goes into it in terms of your actual gait mechanics and all that before your pectoralis comes into play. And with practice, obviously those things will develop. And so you have to just kind of use your own intuition and what players you're working with. But yeah.
All right, we got one from Ruben. This is an unusual question for Ruben. You're gonna have to explain this to me at one point, Ruben. Any suggestion on how to teach the beach service toss in indoor volleyball? So I assume he means the two-handed, right? The two-handed toss that a lot of the beach players use.
Well, I think a lot of the float serves nowadays, if I'm not mistaken, they do use like a two-handed toss. But I think beach volleyball and indoor volleyball are just two separate monsters. I think there's just a whole different game. There's similarities between the two, but they're just a different game. And I think beach volleyball is something that I'm very passionate about. I think definitely would love to do some research there, but they're just two different animals to tackle. So.
All right,
it's
Ruben,
a good question.
Just tell the guys to go play beach and learn how to serve.
Exactly. Play the game. So.
All right. Have you ever seen an activity or task that is not game-like or specific that has provided any transfer to actual skill?
Yeah, I think, it's a good question. I'm a personal believer it's any touch is better than no touch. So if I'm sitting here in my bedroom and I have a volleyball and I just set 100 times every day just to the wall or to the ceiling, that's going to help me, whether it's my own confidence, whether it's actually going to translate, I don't know. But this idea of just touching a volleyball is, I think is crucial. Whether it's passing and like you place a target on the wall, passing against a wall, or whatever it may be. I think they all help. Would I say that that's not really a game like, the transfer? I think if I just do passing against a wall, and it's not going to transfer. But if I use this pass against a wall, then I go and I get I go to like having a ball of toss over the net or versus, a ball hit. I think there's a place for all that to happen. Like for example, in the situation we're in right now, at this point, any touch is better than no touch, right? Allow them to really be able to just touch a volleyball. But to answer your question, if we're in a where nothing's happening and we're living our daily lives as we hopefully will be in a couple months, I would say that the transfer will be very little, to be honest. But there will be some for sure, because you talk about just perception and you talk about all these different things. I think it all helps. But the more game-like it is, I think there'll be more transfer, more positive transfer at least. Yeah.
Makes sense. All right. No more questions at the moment. Are there any things that either maybe we haven't hit on that you think we should, like final notes or any things that you point people to do a little bit more reading or anything along those lines?
No, I think volleyball is one of the it's a different sport, right? You're hitting a ball without using an implement. It's a little different. I think coaches in volleyball, I love the fact that they are interested in actually learning the motor learning end of things. I have so much respect for like GMS, for example, who are actually kind of incorporating motor learning into their practices, and coaches like yourself who are taking the time out to actually just talk motor learning. I mean, I think it's something that we need to, and motor learning is a fairly new field, and so I really enjoy that the volleyball community is kind of really trying to understand this more. I would just encourage coaches to not keep like a sort of linear, really compartmentalized sort of approach, saying that random is always better. And I'm just saying that because That was the structure of our talk. But you got to understand there's a lot of factors that play into how we learn and how we optimally learn something. And so you, as a coach, you have to play around with all of that. And my research, while it's in, attention and intrinsic motivation and the relevant biomechanics of it, there's a lot more to it. And so I think you really have to look into what the problem is, what are you doing already, what the end goal state that you want the player to get to, and how then you're going to progress to that. That's all sort of contingent on the time you have and stuff like that. So there's a lot to look at. So just keep an open mind, I think, is really important. Motor learning has sort of developed into two separate camps now, with people rejecting this sort of schema theory and now going into systems approach, which is great and all, but I think we can learn from both. I think there's a way to kind of, take bits and pieces of each and kind of really recognize what motor learning is. But that's what keeps sort of me into all this, and I hope that eventually, we come up with some stuff. I do have some projects, in publication right now for volleyball, so I really hope that comes out soon, and we'll go from there. But sort of like a long-winded answer of what they should be doing.
No, that's good. All right. Well, thanks a lot, Harjiv. Thanks a lot for everybody for showing up and asking questions. I hope you got a lot out of this. And have a good weekend, everybody.
Thanks for having me, man. Appreciate it.
Bye. Or it's still afternoon for you.
Yeah.
Come on, good night. All right. Good luck with your research.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.